Welcome back to Her Secret Diaries, the place where quiet memories speak the loudest, where ordinary moments hide extraordinary truths, and where stories from the past remind us that every life holds secrets worth telling. If you love heartfelt stories about family, love, mistakes, and the things we discover when it is almost too late, you are in the right place. Today's story is about a grandmother, a recipe everyone believed belonged to her, and a truth that stayed hidden for decades. People say every family has a secret recipe. Sometimes it is written carefully on a yellowed card and tucked inside a cookbook. Sometimes it lives only in memory, passed from hand to hand and heart to heart. And sometimes the story behind that recipe is more complicated than anyone ever imagined. In our family, the secret recipe belonged to Grandma Evelyn. At least, that is what we believed. Every Sunday afternoon, the entire house would fill with the smell of cinnamon, butter, and something warm and sweet that drifted through the hallway long before the food ever reached the table. The windows would fog slightly from the heat of the oven, and Grandma would hum softly as she moved around the kitchen with the calm confidence of someone who had been cooking the same thing for half a lifetime. No one ever questioned it. The recipe was called Evelyn's Honey Apple Cake, and according to every story told at family gatherings, she had created it herself when she was young. The cake became part of our family identity. Birthdays meant honey apple cake. Thanksgiving meant honey apple cake. Even weddings included a version of honey apple cake somewhere on the dessert table. People would ask her how she made it. Grandma would smile gently and say the same thing every time. "Oh, it's just something I came up with a long time ago." Then she would laugh softly and change the subject. When I was a child, I believed my grandmother knew everything. She knew how to fix broken toys with tape and patience. She knew how to calm storms between family members with just a few quiet words. She knew exactly how long cookies should stay in the oven without using a timer. And most importantly, she knew how to make the best cake anyone had ever tasted. I remember sitting at the kitchen table watching her work. Her hands were steady, slow, and practiced. She measured flour without looking at the cup. She cracked eggs perfectly on the edge of a bowl. She stirred the batter with a wooden spoon that looked older than the house itself. Sometimes I would ask if I could help. She always said yes. But helping Grandma did not mean doing much. She would give me small tasks. Hold the bowl, sprinkle the cinnamon, taste this and tell me if it needs more honey. I would taste it and say it was perfect every single time. Because it always was. As I got older, the recipe became something almost legendary in our family. Relatives who lived in other cities would call Grandma and ask her to send them the recipe. Friends begged her to write it down. But she always resisted. "Some things are better learned in the kitchen," she would say. Eventually, though, time began to change things. Grandma's steps became slower. Her hands shook sometimes when she poured the sugar. She began forgetting small details in conversations. But the recipe never changed. The cake always came out exactly the same. Golden on top, soft and warm inside, sweet with honey and apples and just a little bit of cinnamon. When I left for college, Grandma gave me a small notebook. It had a faded blue cover and pages that smelled faintly like vanilla. Inside were dozens of handwritten recipes, soups, cookies, roasted vegetables, family dinners we had eaten for years. And near the middle of the notebook was the one I cared about most. Evelyn's Honey Apple Cake. I remember looking at it carefully. Her handwriting was neat but slightly shaky. There were little notes in the margins. Use fresh apples if possible. Do not rush the batter. Let it cool before slicing. I asked her if this was the real recipe. She smiled. "Yes," she said. "It's yours now." I hugged her tightly before leaving that afternoon. At the time I thought she was simply passing down a family tradition. I had no idea she was also passing down a secret. Years passed. Life moved forward the way it always does. College turned into a job. The job turned into a different city. Family visits became holidays instead of weekly dinners. But every once in a while, usually on quiet weekends, I would open that notebook and make the honey apple cake. The smell filled my apartment exactly the way it had filled Grandma's house. And every time I tasted it, I felt like I was sitting in her kitchen again. It became my way of staying connected to home. Then, one winter, everything changed. Grandma passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 80. The house felt different after that, quieter, emptier. The kitchen that once felt alive with warmth now seemed like a room that had lost its voice. During the days after the funeral, our family gathered to sort through her belongings. Boxes of photographs, old letters tied together with ribbon, cookbooks filled with notes in the margins. I volunteered to organize the kitchen. It felt like the closest place to her. Inside one of the cabinets, I found a small wooden box I had never seen before. It was simple and worn with age. The lid creaked slightly when I opened it. Inside were several folded papers. Most of them looked like grocery lists and small reminders written in her familiar handwriting. But one piece of paper was different. It was older. Much older. The paper was yellow and fragile, and the handwriting was not Grandma's. At the top of the page were the words, "Honey apple cake." Underneath was a list of ingredients: flour, honey, apples, butter, eggs, cinnamon. My heart started beating faster. It looked almost identical to Grandma's recipe. But the name written at the bottom stopped me cold. Margaret Callahan. I had never heard that name before. At first I assumed it might be from a cookbook or a friend. But something about the paper felt personal. It had small stains along the edges, like it had been used many times. There were notes written beside certain steps. Add more honey if apples are sour. Bake slowly. Patience matters. Those notes looked different from the original writing. They looked like Grandma's handwriting, which meant the recipe had been changed slightly over time. But the original was not hers. I stared at that paper for a long time, trying to understand what I was seeing. Grandma had always said she created the recipe herself. Everyone believed it. It was part of the family story. So who was Margaret Callahan? And why had Grandma kept this hidden for so many years? Curiosity slowly turned into a quiet determination. I needed to know. I began by asking my mother. She was sitting in the living room surrounded by photo albums when I showed her the paper. "Do you know who Margaret Callahan is?" I asked. She looked at the name for a moment. Then she shook her head. "I've never heard that before." My aunt didn't know either. Neither did my uncle. It was as if the name had never existed in our family history. But the recipe was real. And someone named Margaret had written it long before Grandma ever shared it with us. That night, I took the wooden box home with me. Inside were a few more papers I had not looked at closely yet. Old envelopes, a faded photograph, and one sealed letter. The envelope was brittle with age. On the front was written a single name. Evelyn, Grandma's name. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The letter inside was written in careful cursive. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear enough to read. "Dear Evelyn, if you are reading this, it means time has passed farther than I ever expected. I suppose that means life continued the way it always does, moving forward whether we are ready or not. I am leaving you this recipe because I know how much you love it. You always said it reminded you of home, even though it was never truly yours. Please do not feel guilty for keeping it. Some recipes belong to kitchens. Others belong to memories. This one belongs to both of us. You once told me that food is the easiest way to give someone comfort. I hope this cake has given your family the same comfort it gave us when we were young. If they ever ask where it came from, tell them whatever story helps them feel warm when they eat it. That will be enough. With love, Margaret." I sat there for a long time after finishing the letter, trying to piece together the story hidden between those lines. Grandma had not stolen the recipe. She had been given it. But the letter suggested something deeper, something emotional, something connected to a past none of us knew about. The photograph inside the box gave another small clue. It showed two young women standing outside what looked like a small bakery. They were laughing. One of them was clearly Grandma, but she looked much younger than any photo I had ever seen. Maybe early 20s. Standing beside her was another woman with dark hair tied back and flour dusting her apron. On the back of the photo were 4 simple words: Evelyn and Margaret. Summer 1958. Suddenly the mystery felt much larger. My grandmother had a life before our family ever existed. A life with people we had never heard about. And somewhere in that life was a woman named Margaret who created the recipe we all believed belonged to Grandma. Over the next few weeks, I began searching through old records, newspapers, and anything else that might reveal more. Eventually, I found something. A small newspaper article from the late 1950s mentioned a bakery called Callahan's Corner. It had been located in a small town 2 hours away from where Grandma eventually lived. The article described it as a popular neighborhood bakery known for its honey apple cake, and the owner was listed as Margaret Callahan. The discovery felt like finding the first piece of a puzzle. Grandma must have known her there. Maybe she worked in the bakery. Maybe they were friends. Or maybe their story was something even more complicated. I drove to that town the following weekend. Most of the buildings had changed over the decades. But after asking around, I eventually found the old location of Callahan's Corner. The bakery itself was gone. In its place stood a small bookstore. Inside, an elderly man working behind the counter listened patiently as I explained why I was there. When I mentioned Margaret Callahan, his expression softened with recognition. "I remember her," he said. "She ran the best bakery this town ever had." I showed him the photograph. He leaned closer and smiled. "That's definitely Margaret." He pointed to the other woman. "And that must be Evelyn. She worked there for a while." My heart skipped a beat. "Did they know each other well?" I asked. The man chuckled quietly. Everyone knew they were close. He paused for a moment. "Very close." I waited for him to continue. But instead, he simply looked at the photo again. "Margaret passed away young," he said gently. "Cancer." It was quick. "What happened to the bakery?" I asked. "It closed not long after." He looked at me with curiosity. "Why are you asking about them?" I hesitated before answering. "Evelyn was my grandmother." The man's eyes widened slightly. "Well," he said softly, "that explains the cake." On the drive home, I thought about everything I had learned. The recipe, the bakery, the friendship between Evelyn and Margaret, and the letter asking Grandma to tell whatever story made people feel warm when they ate the cake. For decades, our family believed the recipe was hers. But the truth was both simpler and more meaningful. It came from someone who mattered deeply to her. Someone she had once stood beside in a kitchen filled with flour and laughter. Someone who trusted her enough to pass on a small piece of their life. The next Sunday, I made the honey apple cake again. The smell filled the house just like always. But this time, I placed 2 slices on the table instead of 1. One for Grandma. And 1 for Margaret. Because some recipes are not just about food. They are about love. About memories. About the quiet promises people make to each other when they believe no one else will ever know. And sometimes those promises last far longer than anyone expects. Even longer than a lifetime. Even longer than the secrets we think we are keeping. That is the story of Grandma's secret recipe. It wasn't truly hers. But the love behind it became part of our family forever. The cake cooled slowly on the kitchen counter, the golden crust settling as the warm smell of honey and apples drifted through the house. I sat at the table watching the steam rise in thin, twisting lines, the same way I used to watch it in Grandma Evelyn's kitchen when I was small. But this time the room felt different. Before, the cake always meant comfort. It meant laughter in the living room, cousins arguing over the biggest slice, and Grandma pretending not to notice when someone cut the cake unevenly. Now it meant questions. Questions about a woman named Margaret Callahan. Questions about a friendship no one in our family had ever spoken about. And questions about a life my grandmother had lived before any of us existed. I took the notebook Grandma had given me years earlier and placed it next to the cake. Her handwriting filled the pages, neat and careful. Each recipe written as if she expected someone to read it decades later. Maybe she had. Maybe that was the reason. She finally wrote down the honey apple cake recipe before giving it to me. I opened the notebook again and looked more closely than I ever had before. The ingredient list was exactly the same as the paper from Margaret's recipe. The instructions were nearly identical too, but there were small additions in Grandma's version. A little more cinnamon, a note about using darker honey for deeper flavor, a line that said, "Let the apples rest in the honey before mixing." They were tiny changes, but they mattered. It meant the recipe had evolved. Margaret created it. Grandma carried it forward. And somewhere between those two moments, the cake became something shared between them. Something alive. I cut a slice and tasted it slowly. It still tasted exactly like my childhood, but now the flavor carried a story. And stories have weight. Over the next few days I kept thinking about the old man in the bookstore, and the way he said Evelyn and Margaret were very close. The way he paused before saying it. The way he seemed to choose his words carefully at first. I wondered if he simply meant they were good friends. But the letter in the wooden box suggested something deeper. Margaret had written about memories they shared. She had written with affection that felt personal. And she had trusted Grandma to keep the recipe even after she was gone. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something important. Our family knew almost nothing about Grandma's life before she met my grandfather. It was as if her story began the day she married him. Everything before that was a blank. One evening I called my mother again. "Do you know where Grandma lived before she met Grandpa?" I asked. My mother thought for a moment. "I think she moved around a little," she said. "But I'm not completely sure." Why I told her about the bakery, about Margaret, about the newspaper article and the man who remembered them, working together. There was a long silence on the phone. "That's strange," my mother finally said. "Grandma never talked about working in a bakery." That answer didn't surprise me anymore. Grandma had clearly kept that part of her life private. But I wondered why, not out of shame. The letter didn't sound like shame, it sounded like nostalgia. Like something beautiful that had ended too soon. That night, I returned to the wooden box again. I searched through the remaining papers more carefully. Most were simple things, old receipts, small notes reminding her to buy flour or sugar. But at the very bottom of the box, I found another envelope. This one was unsealed. Inside was a photograph I hadn't noticed before. It showed the interior of the bakery, shelves filled with bread, glass cases, holding pastries, and behind the counter stood Grandma and Margaret again. They were both laughing. Flour dusted their clothes. Margaret held a cake pan in her hands while Grandma leaned slightly toward her. The moment looked completely natural, like two people who spent every day together. On the back of the photograph was another note. "First honey apple cake. Finally perfect." Underneath the sentence were two signatures. Margaret. Evelyn. I stared at those names for a long time. For the first time, the truth began to feel clear. The recipe had not simply been passed from Margaret to Grandma, they had created it together. Margaret might have written the original instructions, but the photograph proved Grandma was part of the moment it was perfected. The cake belonged to both of them, but only one name was ever remembered. And suddenly I understood why the letter said what it did. Tell them whatever story helps them feel warm. Margaret knew that the full truth might never be told. Maybe because of the time they lived in. Maybe because life had taken them in different directions. Maybe because Grandma eventually built a new life, with my grandfather and raising a family. But Margaret did not seem angry about it. She simply wanted the cake to keep bringing comfort, even if the story behind it stayed quiet. The more I thought about it, the more emotional the discovery became. Because food has a strange power, it travels through generations without explanation. People taste something and feel connected to someone they may never have met. For decades our family had been sharing Margaret's cake without knowing her name. Her creation had lived inside our memories anyway, and now, finally, I knew who she was. The following weekend our family gathered again at Grandma's house. We were finishing the last of the sorting before selling the property. Before everyone arrived, I went into the kitchen and started baking. Flour covered the counter. Apples were sliced carefully. Honey poured slowly into the bowl. As the cake baked, the familiar smell filled the house. Soon my mother walked into the kitchen. She stopped immediately. "That smells like Mom's cake," she said. "It is," I replied. She watched me for a moment. Then she smiled softly. "I'm glad someone kept the tradition going." When the rest of the family arrived, the cake was cooling on the table. Everyone reacted the same way. Surprise. Nostalgia. A little sadness. We cut the cake after dinner, just like we always had. But before anyone took the first bite, I spoke. "There's something I found in Grandma's kitchen," I said. I told them about the wooden box, the photograph, the letter, and Margaret Callahan. At first everyone was quiet. My aunt looked confused. My uncle leaned back in his chair as if trying to process the story. My mother stared down at the cake. "So, the recipe wasn't Grandma's?" she asked gently. I shook my head. "Not exactly." Then I explained the photograph, showing both of them celebrating the first successful cake. "That means they made it together," my mother said slowly. "Yes," I said. No one spoke for a few seconds. Then my uncle smiled. "Well," he said, "that explains why it's so good. Two bakers instead of one." The tension in the room softened immediately. My aunt laughed, and suddenly the story didn't feel like a loss. It felt like an addition. Our family recipe had a larger history than we ever knew. Two young women, standing in a bakery in the summer of 1958, celebrating a cake that turned out perfectly. Neither of them could have imagined that 60 years later their recipe would still be baked in another kitchen by people who never met them. I placed the old photograph in the center of the table. Everyone leaned forward to look. "That's Mom?" my aunt asked. I nodded. "She looks so young," she whispered. "And that's Margaret." I said that name felt important now, like it deserved to be spoken out loud. We all took our first bite of cake together, and something about that moment felt different. The flavor hadn't changed, but the meaning had grown. Now, every slice carried two stories: Grandma Evelyn's life with our family, and Margaret Callahan's bakery, where the cake was born. Two lives connected by something as simple as flour, honey, and apples. After dinner my mother stayed behind in the kitchen with me. She looked at the photograph again. "You know," she said quietly, "Mom rarely talked about her 20s. Maybe those years were complicated." I suggested. "Maybe," she said. But she didn't sound sad. Instead she looked thoughtful. "I'm glad you found this," she added. "Why?" I asked. "Because it reminds me that our parents had lives before us. Real lives, friendships, dreams, stories we may never fully understand." She paused and touched the edge of the photograph. "And that's okay." Later that night, after everyone left, I wrapped the remaining slices of cake and placed the notebook back on the shelf. But I did one small thing differently. On the recipe page I added a new title above Grandma's handwriting: Evelyn and Margaret's Honey Apple Cake. The words looked right. Together. Balanced. Complete. Some secrets fade when they are revealed, but others grow stronger. Because the truth doesn't erase the past, it deepens it. And now, whenever I bake that cake, I imagine two young women in a small bakery kitchen. Flour in the air, laughter echoing off the walls, a cake cooling on the counter while they wait to see if they finally got the recipe just right. They probably never realized that something so simple would last so Long. But sometimes the smallest things become the most enduring. A recipe, a memory, a quiet friendship written between the lines of history. And every time the smell of honey and apples fills the room again, it feels like both of them are still there.